So you'll notice in the agenda that the next session is called Breaking News. What do you reckon that means? It's breaking news. So the issues that became, the issues that were discussed, the issues that people found of most interest, we've created a session just around those, and you're going to find out exactly what it's about right now. It's open, data. Anyone want to guess the third word? Journalism. Open data journalism. So that's our next session. Our panelists are just getting mic'd up. In the meantime, I want to remind you that there's still one slot, I think, available for the unconference this afternoon. So if you're interested in proposing a session for the unconference this afternoon, there's a sign-up sheet outside. Otherwise, visit the sign-up sheets, look at the agenda description, see which one you want to go to. It's going to be informal, more like discussions, topic-specific. So just sign up and see what you'd like to go to. For those of us just joining online, we're about to start the breaking news session on open data journalism. The hashtag for this event is #IOGDC, and your moderator is going to be Alex Howard. Have you got Bill?
I do have Bill. We've got three fellows right there. So perhaps in the proud tradition of shifting things up, we have shifted things up. I had the original idea to talk about breaking news here. Well, we could do that, and I thought about doing an interactive session with you all, but as I've listened to the past couple of days, and certainly as I've been listening to the conversation around open data over the past several years, it's become clear that media and journalism are an important part of this conversation. It came up in the last panel. It's come up over the last several years. So we did what's common in the startup world. We pivoted a little bit. So instead of talking about breaking news, you could talk about how the news is breaking and maybe how data is going to be part of what's coming. And so I reached out to some of the people I knew in the DC area. There's lots of people who are trying to use data to tell stories. And just in case they didn't show up, I put together a presentation that might offer some insight into what's happening in the space. And I'm going to try to go through it quickly in the sense that I want to get to talking with them. So, if I wanted to go through a presentation, fellas, what do I do? Okay. There's the one. How about that? All right, game on. So, you haven't met me yet. My name's Alex Howard. I work at O'Reilly Media, and I have the privilege of getting to write about what's happening in this space, to try to document where people are making a difference, to try to understand where the future is going, try to understand how the people who are succeeding can be scaled and their work can be scaled. So if we look at this moment, we're sitting in this massively networked public sphere. We have, people here who can be connected are. We're having a discussion about the conference as it's going on. The metaphor that's often very useful for this is the stream. If you watch Al Jazeera English, you're familiar with the show called The Stream. It's actually filmed down the street at the museum. It's a different metaphor for how we consume news and how we share it. In that space, journalism itself is shifting because it's now a conversation between the people who are creating the news, the people who are curating the news, the people who are editing the news. We're all looking at the same thing together increasingly, and that really changes the dynamics. It creates new opportunities for feedback loops between media organizations and the people formerly known as the audience. In that context, we know there's a hugely expanding number of data sources, and of course one of them is open government data, the thing that has brought us here today. There's also commercial and industry data, which you can mix into your stories if you're a journalist. There's social and crisis data, the data that is generated from citizens as they tweet, update, post pictures and video. If you're following what's happening in any given story, you quickly see that people are becoming part of it as they publish. In this context, there are some challenges. There's misinformation. There's, in terms of open government data, when journalists think about this, we look at how it is perhaps not as open as it could be. The canonical example of that for people who are working in this space is, of course, a PDF where it is difficult to get the data out of that. We have heard great examples of different companies and different organizations that have managed to get information from PDFs, to scrape it from sites, and make something that matters from it. And we'll be hearing from guys who've done that to my left. If you were here at the Open Government Data Conference 2 years ago, 2010, I think just under 2 years ago, Tim Berners-Lee was there, and he makes a big bet that data-driven journalism is the future of this space. Now, that's a bold claim. I tend to listen to him when he says things like that. In the years since, I think it's proven out to be more the case than not. Now, this isn't a new thing. If you're a journalist, you know that computer-assisted reporting has been around for decades. It's just the tools have shifted a little bit. The context has shifted a little bit. If you go back even further, you can see that things like Napoleon's March and the mortality from that's been graphed out. There have been infographics in books for a long time. But the tools, like I said, are shifting. The ability for journalists to program to make more sense from information, to start hacking themselves, has become part of the conversation. There's a group called Hacks and Hackers now, which gets together and talks about how to work with data, how to work with each other across time zones, across cities. And they make things now. Here's a fun one. This is a roach map made from open government data in New York City, mapping out where the roaches are. This is a fun thing, and maybe not so fun, right? But, and I say fun because it's something you could put together pretty quickly. You can see where this starts to go over time when you start to map other things. For this industry, it's now become an imperative to do this better. If you're following what's happening in the conversation around the future of news, you know that there's sort of a hint that there's a problem here. There's a problem not just in the commercial incentives, there's also a problem in terms of the way people are telling stories, the way that they're sourced, the business models themselves. Some of the early signals in this space suggest that data could be one of the answers. They're an important answer. The Texas Tribune, which launched not so long ago in Texas, trying to use a combination of data and the web and good investigative journalism, they found that when they put their databases online, they get vast amounts of traffic to them. And those databases stay put, right? They're not something that necessarily have to be updated in the same way that a story would be, because they might be living stories on their own. And interactives can become quite compelling. In the news business, they call about things being sticky. Lots of time on site, lots of time in a given site. So you look up to Toronto and see someone that's graphed out election night results. You look from the New York Times work, graphing out Clean Water Act violations around the country. And the tools themselves have become much more democratized to the media, too. Used to be the only people in the Valley could use things like this. Now, it's not uncommon for a newsroom developer to use an Amazon instance and spin up an application himself. Now, you don't want to necessarily open source all the information if you're trying to protect it to someone else's servers. It's a different issue. But certainly the ability to be nimble and move quickly has changed things. And they can now do things like graph out the votes for inside of Congress, or things like this. Now, we haven't talked a whole lot about WikiLeaks here, but in the open data journalism world, it's certainly one of the stories in the past couple of years, because we've seen how many different organizations have combined together to publish the information, to map out the data, to make sense of this gigantic data dump, and to find stories within all the data. And that, again, is one of the most important things. Here's a graph of the Cablegate, of course, the US Embassy dispatches. The thing that is perhaps really important to talk about in this context, though, is looking at the relationship between open data and press freedom. They're not necessarily always in the same place when we're talking about standing up platforms. We think this has come up in the past. Nathan Heller is curating a whole Tumblr full of these things over at Global Integrity, where you see that you can stand up open data around services, around other information, and it may not necessarily correlate entirely to whether you're letting journalists go and tell stories. It's something I want to watch, something I want to call out, but not dwell too much on here because I want to get through this. One of the things that I think is very interesting to see is the combination of citizen-generated data with the web and government data. Creates new systems for crowdsourced accountability. If we're in a highly networked society, it creates new opportunities for citizens to act as censors. They're generating data. That data can be used in stories. In this case, you're looking at a picture of Japan, a map of Japan with radiation data on it. That data came from government, and it also came from Geiger counters that were distributed and used by people, including Zany Jardin and other folks, to go around the country and actually detect themselves what was going on. It's a really important, I think, look at the future. And if you look at the business models of journalism, it might give us some ideas as well. So if the first idea was to find and scrape data, things like, say, pulling out what's in thomas.gov. The second is to say, give us the data from agencies. Step 3 may be rolling your own data. It may be creating the data themselves if government itself doesn't release it to you. And that could be very important in geographic areas. And in this case, here's an example of an open source Geiger counter that Safecast managed to design. So something you could create data yourself with. Now, I mentioned the industry is changing. One of the important ways it's changing is that data and algorithms and the web are combining together to start to tell stories on their own. This might seem like it's out of science fiction, but robo-journalism is something that's here. And for commoditized news, things like sports reporting, it's already part of the conversation. You should expect in certain areas where a person doesn't have to be there, that some kinds of commodity news will simply be reported on their own. Now that's kind of scary for a lot of reasons, but in fact the robot could be bringing you your news. So it's going to call into question huge amounts of the industry in terms of what value do you bring to the table. Well, the value is this. It's that humans still respond to stories, and that journalists still matter for finding the stories in the data. If government is releasing vast amounts of data, then it's the responsibility of journalists and editors and citizens working together to find out what's true and what's not, and to make it into a narrative that's coherent and that gets out ahead of what matters in society. So the space is blending. We've got data journalists and civic hackers. Turns out they're working on the same stuff with the same tools. So we can call people different things, but they're coming at the same areas. They're coming to the same places. They're using the same data. They're increasingly talking about the same sorts of things. And to my left, I have one of them, Chris DAmico. Chris worked with his wife to create something here in DC called Homicide Watch. We'll be talking about that a bit. But this is a next-generation data journalism platform. It's combining together government data with citizen-generated data, with blogs, with maps, and making something that tells stories in a different way, that covers something in a different way. Working together, we can start to think about how some of these things might change the conversation around the issues that really matter, around poverty, education, the environment, energy, transit, dirty politics, you name it. That's what I'm interested in terms of seeing where the outcomes are, the downstream outcomes, not how many data sets are put online, right? But how they're being used and what actually changed for citizens. Now, I can't think of three other people I'd rather have right now to talk about this thing than the gentleman to my left. I tried hard to bring up some of my female compatriots in the data journalism and journalism world. People's schedules did not allow it, because this was more of a last-minute thing. So thank you all for making time. As I introduced, Chris DAmico to my left. He is at Eyes East if you're in the Twitter sphere. Chris works at State Impact and works in Homicide Watch. Bill Allison is part of the investigative reporting group at the Sunlight Foundation. If you were here earlier, you heard from John Wunderlich, who works at Sunlight as well, as policy director. And then Craig Hammer, who is here at the World Bank. And I met Craig when he was in Moldova trying to help build capacity for people there to do data journalism on their own. So with that introduction, I'm going to go from far side and come on back. Why is it important to build capacity for data journalism in other countries, Craig? What's happening now?
Well, I mean, I think the good news is it's a pretty intuitive reason to engage journalists in this space. I mean, in many cases, journalists are the front line of people who can actually turn data into knowledge, who can reach into the numbers and pull out the human story. So the World Bank Institute launched a data journalism program just about a year ago to try to find a way to reverse engineer ways to get journalists in our client countries from where they are now to be able to provide a suite of additional skills. It's not to reinvent the process of journalism, it's to supplement the skills they already have with some additional skills that better enable them to be able to use, own, and report on the data that's coming through the increasing number of open data platforms that are coming online. And so right now the process is pretty straightforward. It does what it sounds like. We engage with journalists in our client countries. We work to teach them how to do things like Spreadsheet 101, how to create a pivot table, how to scrape data from the net, how to clean it, how to create data visualizations, and then how to craft narratives around those visualizations. The process itself has happened in Kenya and Moldova, as Alex had mentioned, and an additional suite of data journalism boot camps are on track to be rolled out this coming year. And the process is important because it does two things. On the capacity development side, it's the training piece. It's what you would expect a rigorous 3-day experiential hands-on learning process to be. But it's also about, as Alex mentioned, mixing. It's about breaking down traditional silos between media, civil society, the civic hacker community, faith-based organizations, the litany of data consumers and producers in a country to get them to communicate with each other, to create a self-reinforcing community practice so that after the bank executes its exit strategy, or whomever happens to be there, the community will continue to mix, will continue to produce and demand data, to close that feedback loop, to enable government to be able to provide not just data, but the right data. To be able to provide data which is reflective or responsive to what the public wants. And the process itself is ongoing. And so far, the goal, of course, is to get toward those downstream results that Alex was talking about.
Thank you, Greg.
Cheers.
So Sunlight has been active in a lot of different areas. I don't know if everyone realizes that you have a substantial reporting group and that you are telling stories there. If you go to reporting.sunlightfoundation.com, you can see all the work that's there. And it's quite data-driven. You don't put things up there unless you can show your work in that context. What are some of the stories that you've been able to do using data as the fuel? And what stories would you not have been able to do if you couldn't have gotten the data?
Well, you know, just yesterday, and I'm going to toot my own horn a little bit, but we took a look at, there's been a lot of talk about campaign 2012 and will Mitt Romney outraise Barack Obama? Will he raise more money, which is something that has never happened, a challenger raising more money than an incumbent president. And there's a lot of talk about, you know, the super PACs and all the different features of the 2012 election landscape that didn't exist before. So what we did is we ran the numbers. We ran them starting in 2011 when Barack Obama started raising money. We looked all the way through to 2012 when Mitt Romney started raising money, and we found out that Obama has about a $158 million advantage over Romney still, and will most likely raise more money than Mitt Romney. You know, it's hard to predict the future, but we just wanted to take a look at what the numbers are today, because there's been all of these stories about how Romney is going to outraise Obama, and we wanted to see what the numbers would tell us. I mean, they were looking at 1 month. We went back and looked at a couple of years and really got to where the story is. I mean, a couple of other things that we've been able to do. Well, actually, I wanted to go a little bit beyond just what we do. I think that the classic story about, you know, with data, or a classic story, USA Today last April did a wonderful series on, in the United States there were lead smelters, these things that would basically process lead, and that were all over the country and have shut down, and as years have gone on, they're turned into residential communities and whatnot. And what ends up happening is you have people living in areas where the soil still has a lot of lead contamination. And the EPA had this data for years, didn't make it available to the press, to the public, to home buyers. They didn't, a lot of times they didn't do the testing that they were supposed to do. And anyway, USA Today was able to get this, map this data, put it online, and show where people were in danger of having their kids, you know, be contaminated by lead when they go out and play in the parks, which seems to me to be a huge public service. Again, because they were able to get this data, and I believe they had to FOIA it and go through those channels, they could do this wonderful story that they couldn't have done without that data, without information. I think another example of this, when US Air, the flight that crashed in the Hudson and made the guy named Sully Sullenberg, who was the pilot who basically kept everybody from dying. This was the incident where there was a bird strike and all of the engines of the plane causing it to dip into the water. Shortly after that happened, you know, the first thing reporters started asking is, well, how often, what kind of a danger do birds pose, and how often does this happen to planes, and, you know, is this something we should be much more concerned about? The FAA maintained a bird strike database, but they didn't make that available to the public, and I think it was the Associated Press eventually got it. But they had to FOIA this information, and for a long time the FAA was saying, well, we can't give this away because it's really the airport's data, it's not our data, and the airports aren't covered by the Freedom of Information Act. And so eventually, though, the FAA relented, and you could have that data and you could start looking. Are there airports more dangerous than other airports? Are there, you know, can you have pressure then from local government, which has a role in regulating airports, to do something about bird strikes? So that's the kind of thing that you can do. You know, if you don't have the data, you can't do that story. At Sunlight, you know, we try to, the last thing I'll talk about, we try to make our own data as well as pry it loose from government. One of my favorite sites that we do is something called Party Time, and it's a site that tracks fundraisers by members of Congress. We have a huge amount of data at the Federal Election Commission on the money they raise. We have very little information about how they raise this money. And so what we've done is, using old-fashioned shoe leather reporting, go around, talk to lobbyists, talk to people who get these invitations, people who run political action committees, talk to the parties themselves, talk to the people who do the fundraising. We have sources who give us the actual invitations, some of which are hilarious. You have like Margarita Mondays and all kinds of different things. But we put these things online, and you can see who are the lobbyists who are hosting the fundraisers, where are the fundraisers taking place. Sometimes they take place in lobby shops or the UPS townhouse, or sometimes they're listed as financial industry breakfast or healthcare industry luncheon. So they're targeting certain donors, and so you can see all this and you get a little bit of information about how members of Congress raise money. And then we turn this into data and make it available for anybody to download or get to. And it's been used in all kinds of reporting, and it was also used, we believe, well, the Washington Post took our data after some congressional ethics investigators went after members who were raising money during the Dodd-Frank debate and raising money for the financial interests, and investigated them. And you know, all of those invitations were in our database. And we'd like to think that the congressional, I can't say that for sure, I just don't know. But that was made possible by, or Washington Post could do that story because we had that data.
Thank you, Bill.
Stop it there.
I think that offers some perspective on stretching the definition of what we think about as open government data. In many cases, we're always thinking about what government is releasing. My understanding in talking to journalists in this town is there's a feeling that government will tell you one thing, and the role of good journalism is to find out what they don't want to tell you. And that many times that information comes from many sources that are not on an open government data platform anywhere. So with that particular context, Chris, you built something in your spare time. You used to work at the NewsHour and now at NPR State Impact Project, where you're collecting data from lots of different sources and making it available. Can you talk a little bit about what you did and what it does and what impact it's having on the DC community?
Yeah, thanks. So it's interesting, you showed the three stages of open data that my colleague Javon Marati described so well. Stage 1 is find it and scrape it. Stage 2 is ask for it nicely. And stage 3 is make your own. And we really, with Homicide Watch, we really operate in all three of those spaces. So we, in some cases, are asking nicely, to start there. So the city, the Office of the Chief Technology Officer in DC provides data feeds, provides GIS data, which we use. We actually don't use the crime feed. None of our data that comes in is automated. But we do use shapefiles for neighborhoods, for zip codes, for police districts. And we use that to check our work. We are occasionally getting stuff that is on the web. When we started, we found that there was an enormous amount of information about crime and about criminal justice in DC that was available, but it wasn't easy to find or it wasn't easy to use. So court dockets are online, for example. You can look up online and see, if you know who you're looking for, you can see what court dates are coming up. You can see their entire court process. But you have to know who you're looking for. You have to know names. You have to know sometimes date of birth. You have to know enough identifying details to know which Mike Jones you're trying to find. Court documents, charging documents are available, but they're not easy to use. So we created a calendar, we created a documents library for every piece of, every document related to every murder case that we cover. So the way we get those is Laura, my wife, goes to the courthouse, and in the course of covering hearings, she goes to a room on the 4th floor in the courthouse, prints out charging documents, indictments, anything that comes up, takes them home, scans them, redacts them, takes out, because Social Security numbers tend to be in there, witness names are occasionally in there, redacts some of that information, and then puts them into Document Cloud, and then puts them on our site. And so In that case, we are, I think that's probably in category 1 of finding and scraping. And then the other thing we've tried to do is turn our reporting process into data. So every story we write about every homicide victim, every suspect, every incident is data. We can remix that, we can see it, we know where it is, it's always going to be on one place. Every time we write about a victim or a suspect, those go onto a page for every victim and suspect. And we try very hard not to lose any information.
So what I hear from you is still there's a very important human component here, that being your wife, who's a beat reporter.
Yes.
Who is actually not just going to some place online and getting data, but actually going, extracting it, and then transferring it by sneaker net to where then you put it together somewhere else.
Yeah, so with crime data especially, I've never seen a data feed that's faster than a reporter.
So, Craig, you've gotten some perspective on what's happening around the world in this, and in terms of what it takes to build the capacity for people to do this. What are the major challenges to minting more practitioners out there, and what are some of the ways people are addressing?
Well, I think the entry point, I mean, has got to be a bit more clear to some of the practitioners that we're working with. In this case, you know, the reality is that a program, an open data journalism program, could go in any direction. And so for our purposes, the value addition is for the bank is working with public spending data, because it informs all downstream sectoral investments, and therefore you could work in education, health, you know, public service delivery, and so forth, just by following the money. And for us, it's a process to be able to ensure that the participants, media practitioners that we're working with, are able to meaningfully engage around public spending data as a first entry point into further data literacy. And so in some cases, we've had to reverse engineer ways, again, to get our participants up to a point where we can meaningfully work with public financial management data. And so in some cases, it means starting not necessarily with the actual data literacy process. It means going back a couple of steps and doing budget literacy processes, so that you get an understanding of what a budget cycle looks like, what your procurement cycle looks like in the country, you know, what the entry points is across an entire budget cycle are, you know, the extent to which you know, the public perspective is integrated into public spending priorities by Parliament, and what the implementation of the budget and disbursement processes are, and so forth. And then going into, now that you understand what the budget processes are, how can we use data, the budget data that's coming through, for example, you know, from an individual line ministry, or from through one of the open government platforms, sorry. To be able to use the data, to be able to reach into the numbers and pull out the human stories that are meaningful for hundreds of thousands, in some cases, of readers and listeners. And so for us, I mean, the key line of engagement and the key challenges, I think, to overcome really are how to engage the media practitioners on a level where the data can be viewed as a usable and useful resource.
So I have to ask you, Bill, Sunlight has been one of the most important open government advocacy organizations around. You've been staunch proponents of open data, open government data. How good is the data that our federal government and state governments are publishing? And how well can you use it in your reporting?
Oh boy. I mean, you know, of course it's a mixed bag. It's very hard to characterize all of the data that's being released. I do find, you know, and just speaking as a journalist, and anytime I get government data, I always have to spend an awful lot of time, either me, actually it's my poor colleagues who have to do this now, spend an awful lot of time going through, massaging it, you know, making sure that you've got things accurate, and making sure that you know, you find government data, just the quality of it, you know, things in the wrong columns, it's rarely standardized. You find all kinds of mistakes in it. You know, one of my favorites was that in FEC data, and you would think that the FEC, which has been doing this for years and years and years, would be able to catch when somebody adds 3 extra zeros to the end of a contribution, and so instead of a $1,000 contribution, there's a $1 million contribution, and they would just have a program that would automatically flag that. I mean, you find things like that in government data all the time, and it makes it very difficult to work with. Now, the quality of what they're releasing, I think, is another thing that's very problematic. And I don't know if John Wunderlich talked about this when he was here, but the Department of Homeland Security, as part of their open government plan, is coming up with just an index of all the data sets that they keep. And I think they have like about 900 that they've identified so far, and they're going to have something like 1,600. And I'm great. I would love to have that document, but they're not going to release it. And because they feel like if they had a document like that, it may give away information about what they're doing or what they're. So, I think this is one of the big frustrations, is that when you're trying to work with government data, it's always an uphill battle. You're always asking for things that isn't available, or there's information missing from it. One of the things we tried to do very early on was get congressional correspondence with different federal agencies. One of the big things that members of Congress do is oversee federal, the different federal agencies. They do a lot of constituent service, and they write a lot of letters to the Department of Defense and to agriculture and all these different agencies. So we would FOIA, and we're working with the Pentagon to try to get the information about what members of Congress send to them. We ask for it in electronic format, and we go back and forth, back and forth. Finally, we get it. They send it to us electronically as TIFF files, these image files. What they did was they printed out their database, they took pictures of it, they put it on a compact disc and sent it to us, a CD-ROM, and sent it to us. And so I was so pissed off that we had one of our office people do OCR it, and it took a lot of time to clean it up. We were able to debug it and put it online as data, which was, and found out that the #1 thing that members of Congress were writing to the Pentagon about was congressional travel, when the Pentagon would basically fly members around the country. So. But I think that's always a challenge, and one of the big things is if you look at what's on like data.gov, a lot of it are just data sets that have already been released before. There's nothing particularly new there. The high value data sets that were supposed to be released under the Open Government Directive, I mean, most of them, frankly, aren't very high value to journalists. And I say that with always the caution that you never know what is going to be important. But I think the donkey populations is not, which is one of the things that Interior released, is not one of the things that I think are most newsworthy. So, and at the state level, and I think it's a really mixed bag.
So it's a good reality check. The words scrape and munch come up a lot when I talk to data journalists, because if you're not familiar with that space, you certainly know that converting what is an analog document into a digital one isn't so easy. And if you want to make data from it, then it means you have to extract it. So part of the context for this is open government. And clearly open government isn't just about what the White House is doing or Congress is doing or not doing, or state houses or government entities itself. It's also about what we're all doing, and journalists are a big part of that. What part of your work now at Homicide Watch, and to some extent NPR State Impact, because NPR has been out in front in terms of adopting some social media platforms, do the people formerly known as the audience play in the reporting, in helping you find what's happening and then reporting it out?
So in a couple of ways. I think part of it is simply on the demand side. The audience has shown an interest in finding out and understanding what their government is doing, how they interact with it, particularly on the service side. I think we've seen that from the Texas Tribune. I think we've seen that from Homicide Watch. One way our audience interacts with us, which is maybe a little strange, is we've become very adept at watching our search traffic and watching what people are looking for on our site. So in some ways, it's our audience is finding ways to, whether they realize it or not, tell us what to look for. So we've done this a couple of times where a murder will happen in DC, and we cover every homicide, crime to conviction. We have a database of 195 victims, 144 suspects, and 192 cases. Some of those cases are multiple victims. So when a murder happens in DC, people tend to go to Google, search homicide near such and such address, so-and-so was killed, and they end up on Homicide Watch DC. And we've learned to watch our search traffic come in through Google Analytics, through WordPress stats, through other tools. And we see people searching for names. When we see a name we don't recognize, it tells us there's something here. There's something happening. There's something we don't know about. And we've used that as a clue to go to the police and say, do you know about, say, a stabbing at Fort Stanton Park last night? Do you know about, do you know the ID of this victim? Is his first name Jamal? Is he 17? And so we've been able to use technically a private data set, our search analytics, to ID murder victims and to find unreported homicides. And there's a government part of that too, but it's knowing what to look for. And our audience has really been a key driver in telling us what we're missing.
One of the things that I would love to see happen between media and government is more of a demand-side response. There's been a conversation now for some time, I think, around calibrating data releases that are desirable and high value with FOIA requests. Hasn't quite come together yet. But for countries that are adopting freedom of information laws, this is going to be a crucial thing to think through. FOIA costs money. So to what extent data can be released proactively perhaps represents one of the more important cost savings that exists in the space. This hasn't been proven out, but for governments that are thinking about what they want to release, you could look at what journalists are asking for and maybe start there. So I want to start taking a question since we have someone up here and we've got about 10 minutes.
Hello, I'm Erik Mallens from the University of Ghent. I think there's one very important point that you have not spoken anything about. That's the source referencing. Let's say there's an awful lot of open data out there, and it's easy to combine all these data sets, and me and you, we can come to different conclusions then. Now, if you want to be a good journalist, you do not only have to make your statement or your story, but you should also reveal how you got to this conclusion. And you should do this in an open way. So, as I stated on Monday, you need a kind of recalculable feedback channel where you always have your provenance info or your trust info or your source referencing. So what's your view on that?
You guys want to take that one? I'd certainly agree that showing your work, showing the data that undergirds a visualization or undergirds a story is very important. I would caution that you can't always show your sources in some contexts, but
yeah, I mean, with the data, we always put everything up online. That when we use data, when we show exactly what we have, we make it available for download. And Sunlight is a huge proponent of open data, and we certainly practice it. And we show you which slices of the data we're taking. Sometimes when we do stories, so we really try to make our, present our work as, and I think that all journalists should. I think that it's when you are producing data, nothing makes me more suspicious than when somebody won't show me something. And it happens with, if you're reading some spectacular journalistic expose and they're not, releasing the documents or they're not releasing the data that they based it upon, that makes me a little bit less comfortable. Obviously depending on the journalist, and there are some times when you absolutely can't because of the nature of the information, if it's national security or whatever. But in general, though, I think that people should make as much of the data available as possible. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, so one of our early decisions with Homicide Watch was to have something of an open notebook policy. Laura likes to describe it as anything that, back when she was a newspaper crime reporter, anything that would have been on her desk, in her notebook, on her computer, for the most part, should be on the site somewhere. One thing we found is that there's a huge audience demand for just the raw information that we use. So our court documents, for example, are one of the most popular things on our site. And we'll write a story saying this is what the documents say. We'll build a narrative out of it, but the raw document is right there, and it's always at the bottom of the blog post. You can always find it in our documents library. We, with our victim and suspect data, we tend to aggregate that from a variety of sources, but it tends to all be on the site. So things like age, race, gender, of every suspect. You can usually backtrace those to the site. We put original press releases from the police department on the site. So when we write up, we have an ID, here's what the police said. Here's exactly what the police said. And we'll write a summary, but part of our goal is to get out of the way of the information and to help people find what they're looking for, but not get in their way.
So there's an interesting relationship between the open source community and the open source software and journalists who are using open data. Anecdotally, I've observed that many of people in that community are choosing to build with those tools. And part of that's influenced by organizations like the Knight Foundation asking that platforms that are created from their funds are made open source. Part of that is also influenced by the fact that budgets are a real problem in media world right now. And if you're going to be a scrappy startup in the news world or anywhere else, then you have to be able to use the best tools you can afford. Sometimes those might be closed source, sometimes those might be open source. But if you hang out with this group of folks, showing your work is very important. And that counts for code, and that counts for data. Another question
Thanks.
back there?
Hi, I am a journalist from Moldova, and I would like to ask you a question about management of open data projects. Open data are offered for free, but if to put data in a newspaper, it means more costs, it means platforms, it means training for the staff how to do it better. So more costs, and my question is, how do you sell it? How do you make money on this in journalism? Because everybody wants information for free. Thank you.
Well, I think you raised a key point, and in the context of our engagement, I mean, that's usually priority number one, because the bottom line is that if you don't engage the media owners, the gatekeepers, then however well or high capacity the journalists are, the bottom line is the stories may never get out. So engaging media owners, engaging the editors in the first instance is a key component of this process, and what that means is speaking to them in a language which resonates. Because historically, as much fun as it is to wave one's finger in someone's face and say you have a moral duty to report factually and use data because it's important for people, at the end of the day, these are businesses. And so talking to media owners by saying that there are revenue generation opportunities by having data desks in their media houses is one way to do it. And that is to point, for example, at Fortune 500 media companies looking at revenue generation by, say, The Guardian or the New York Times or Der Spiegel or Bloomberg, and demonstrating how they can use in-house data and realize revenue through things like licensing that data toward the creation of apps and have a profit-sharing model feed money back into the media house is one way to do it. Another way is to talk about interesting research which is now surfacing on the relationship between the ad market versus the trust market. I mean, as ad revenue starts to migrate away from traditional media sources towards social media, there's increasing understanding that fact-based reporting can create something called the trust market, which has valuation, which you can assign a value to that. And so, and then of course, it's also helpful sometimes to put the fear of God into some media owners by saying your choices are jump on board the data journalism train or you're going to get left behind. There are ways to be able to encourage and demonstrate that there are ways that data-driven journalism can not only improve the quality of journalism in the media house, which has also got value, but by demonstrating that curating data themselves, looking at, for example, in some cases where you have media houses that are very, very old, they're sitting themselves on decades or more worth of their own data. That could be also a revenue generation opportunity for them.
There are definitely news organizations that have been leaving money on the table for some time on the internet. And often it's because there's a cultural challenge. It's not exactly an issue that's just endemic to the academy or to government or anywhere else. Newsrooms are shifting, and using new tools, using the internet, using social media, that's not something that always comes easily, and it's not always welcome to people who've been doing things in a certain way.
Almost a problem endemic to institutions.
Might just be, and that driver of change, I think for a lot of institutions, it's going to be results. Do you get a huge audience through creating a really good interactive? Does that interactive, because of the huge audience, then make money? Does that interactive, because of the huge audience, then make One of the people I asked to join us here couldn't make it. It was Brian Boyer, who used to work on the news apps team in the Chicago Tribune. And he's now moved to DC. He's going to be working in NPR, which is building up this team because they decided to invest in this stuff. And that their news apps get a lot of attention. And that's something you can then tell your sales team and come back. It's part of the conversation. So question back there, and then I want to get to you, Brandon. I think then we'll have to call it.
Okay, thank you, Alex. This is Saf from Socrata. I have a question about how do we make it easier for journalists and media organizations to use the data that government organizations are publishing. A lot of our city customers, Chicago, Seattle, for instance, are publishing real-time 911 data. Data directly from their 311 systems, for instance. These are being published every 15 minutes, sometimes on a daily basis. At the federal level, the CFPB published credit card data a couple of weeks ago. There was instantly a story in Fortune about that. The EPA has done a great job of publishing TRI data, radiation data, following the Japan earthquake. So my question to you is, this data is coming online, and where are you finding that there is friction for you guys in order to use the data? Is it discovery? Is it the ability to comprehend the data? Is it the ability to reuse it, to aggregate it? Give us some ideas on how we can help you use this data to make your jobs easier.
Bill?
Oh boy, I mean, you know, one of the tools, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things is knowing that the data is there. Like one of the tools that Sunlight has just built is something called Scout that combs through federal regulatory data, congressional record, and a whole host of other things. So if you're tracking a particular issue, you can, and let's say you're looking at just the word the internet, and then lo and behold, you can find all kinds of different stories about the internet. And I think we used it, we found out that the Office of Management and Budget had approved a particular regulation by the FCC requiring television stations to put certain information online about their political advertising, which isn't all that interesting, but the point of it is that we got this tip off of this thing that's scraping all these different sources. I think that having that kind of thing so you know about it is good. And then a second thing, though, is really manipulating the data in interesting ways. And I think that there is kind of a space, you know, like right now it's very easy for a news organization to put a video online, you know, thanks to YouTube and there are other platforms that let you do this too. We don't quite have the same tools for data. I mean, we have some, but a lot of them require developers to use. And I think that what's missing, though, is something where, you know, somebody like me who's not particularly technologically sophisticated could take some of the, say, my FE, you know, we did it with using Socrata with this story and did some simple charts. But there are other kinds of visualizations that we might have liked to have been able to do, timelines and so on, that aren't quite as accessible or easy to do. And I think that that's kind of a space that's missing right now is, you know, for things like, you know, timelines, network analysis. There's like a, you know, a whole host of tools that I think, you know, that just don't exist in a format that most reporters can engage with them and do something and express the data online.
Can we take one more? We can. No, all right, Brand, I'm sorry. I'm getting the hook. But the good news is that, as is the case in a lot of journalism these days, this conversation can continue, right? These guys are all accessible online. I certainly am too. So if you have questions, tweet them out, and maybe we'll get back to them. Thank you for getting up there. Thank you, everyone, for participating.